Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Elevenses, Sunday the, no, it's not, I've got the wrong date there. It's Wednesday the 17th, isn't it, of March. Elevenses number 121, and astonishingly, that brings us to the end of an entire year of lockdown Elevenses. So what have we got for you today? With no further ado, Tin-tacks spread at a popular biker meeting point. The National Motorcyclists Council is officially launched. Welsh riders are frustrated as their devolved government hangs back on bike training. Traffic England is criticised for a bad taste smart motorway campaign. Honda sales dip in China, but positive bike sales there are fueled by electric bikes. And are IAM riders better than ordinary riders? I'll have a look at a study which has just been revealed. So settle yourself down for the next 25 minutes or so for some topical news, some possibly controversial views, and some better biking tips. Okay, Sue, Adrian, and Cheryl have also good morning. Good morning, everybody. Right, okay, so on with the show with no further ado. This is the collection of tin-tacks and nails that was recovered from the parking area at Rye Quay. I found this on the Kent Fire and Rescue page, their Biker Down or Fire Bikes page, I should say. And Jim Sanderson of Kent Fire and Rescue says it's a sad example of the worst of human intolerance. The barrier there prevents access to motor vehicles, but it's possible to ride around it. And so motorcycle parking has been tolerated for a very long time on the quayside at Rye, and it's a popular bike meeting point basically, and it's probably been left pretty much alone because it doesn't really interfere with anybody. When they need that area for the sort of market, then the bikers don't go there. The rest of the time it's just a bit of open car parking space. And of course, the bikers who do go there bring a considerable amount of business to local shops. There's a cafe just over the road, and there's a fish and chip shop just opposite as well. And both do a roaring trade, as you'd predict in summer. But you know, right through the year, it's a meeting point for motorcyclists. So you know, although those nails could have put ordinary members of the public at risk, you know, particularly children, you know, run around and likely to trip over. It's, I think, fairly obvious that whoever spread them was targeting the bikers who park on that particular spot, and it was aimed at causing punctures for those riders, but with zero regard, of course, to the potential danger to the rider of experiencing a suddenly deflating tyre at speed. Now, there have been a number of complaints from locals over the years, something that came to a head during the lockdown earlier this year, when they thought groups of bikes were breaking lockdown restrictions. And of course, as I've said before, if you are out there breaking lockdown restrictions, you are only too obvious. You stick out like a sore thumb riding in a group in the first place, and because of, you know, there's bound to be somebody in the group with a loud exhaust. It was shown later when a newspaper got involved in doing a study with a noise gun that in fact most motorcyclists were in fact well within the speed limit, and in fact weren't making excessive noise either. They were making, most bikes did have perfectly legal exhausts. But of course, there are always the exceptions, and those are the ones that people spot. So, you know, whilst lockdown continues, we all want to regain our freedom of movement, but you can understand the frustrations of local people who see riders as breaking the rules. In this case, there were reports from residents that over 40 motorcycles have been counted parked in the area at a time when riders are supposed to stay local. When riding, you are permitted to ride your motorcycle, but the rule is stay local, although nobody really knows what local means. But having said all that, there is absolutely no excuse for potentially life-threatening actions like this. So right now, the Kent Fire Bike team are actually in discussion with local authorities, and they say they stand with motorcyclists on this issue. Meanwhile, Jim says, be very careful if you go to right after lockdown, and please ride considerately through the town. There are two sides to this, and tolerance is required from both. And I would say that is well put there by Jim Sanderson of Kent Fire and Rescue. And with potential conflicts like this rearing their heads, and even more likely to rear their heads, over the coming months, I suspect, the newly formed National Motorcyclists Council, something I reported on last month, duly launched publicly on the 5th of March, and I suspect they're likely to have their hands full with their claimed goal of working together to help assure a positive and sustainable future for motorcycling. Because I certainly think that if they're going to do a job for motorcyclists, which is what they claim, they need to get out there and deal with motorcyclists and not just talk to government and other bodies. They claim to bring together a wide spectrum of representatives from national organisations, including rider campaign groups to sports representatives, off-road and green roads interests, and road safety experts. But again, it's closed groups. Where is the broader appeal to the average rider who's not interested in getting involved in any kind of group activities? Anyway, whilst they're looking for causes to chase, perhaps they can tackle the Welsh devolved government on CBTs, because in another news story on Friday last week, the Welsh First Minister disappointed riders desperately waiting to renew their CBTs across the Principality by failing to fall into line with England by announcing a restart date for bike training in Wales. Now, no news in this case is bad news because of that ongoing uncertainty, not just for the riders, but for the training schools, of course, who are trying to get back to work. And the latest update from the DVSA simply says they're working closely with the Welsh Government and stakeholders to agree restart dates for lessons and DVSA rider and driver testing services, and that they will provide more info as soon as they are able to. Now, I fully understand the need to get COVID figures down as low as possible before easing lockdown restrictions, but as it's been said many times, CBT and bike training generally is a relatively low risk activity when you compare it with many other activities that are already being opened up. It took the DFT here quite a while to realize that bike training rules could be eased ahead of car training, for example, and that because the training itself takes place in the outside, it's safer than testing, which requires sitting either in a theory test centre or in a waiting room waiting for your examiner to appear. So hopefully Welsh trainers will get the nod soon, and Welsh riders can get back to doing what they like to do best, which is ride motorcycles. Okay, so that's a good time to remind you that I am locked down currently, but I'm not shut down. I am taking bookings for my restart date, which is going to be Monday, the 29th of March. I already have several in the diary, which is good news because I do need to rebuild some income. And I'm still available for the Back to Biking free webinars on Fridays. We'll still be doing a couple of those before we get back out there on the road. And of course, I'm also offering online coaching to anybody who is too far away or too busy to get to a practical riding course. So, do take a look at what I have to offer in terms of rider training. Okay, so sometimes though I do look at a rider a campaign of some sort, and I wonder who actually came up with the idea in the first place, but who on earth actually authorized the campaign to go ahead and be made public. Transport England have a new campaign, excuse me, to explain the issues of all lane running on smart motorways. Those, you'll recall, are the ones where there's no hard shoulder, where you can actually come to a standstill off the live lanes in the event of emergency. Unfortunately, this new campaign has left relatives of drivers who've been killed on these roads after breaking down or having a collision rather unhappy. Claire Mercer's husband, Jason, and another driver, the 22-year-old Alexandru Merganu, were both killed after a minor collision on the M1 near junction 34. In order to assess damage, they pulled over as far to the left of the motorway as they could, but they were limited by barriers and bankings. Unfortunately, the stopped vehicle detection technology on this stretch of motorway is the same as is installed on over 80% of all smart motorways, and it's incapable of detecting stopped vehicles in a live lane. And minutes later, they were hit by an HGV. Now, this is not an isolated incident because no less than 4 people have died on that stretch of road in just 10 months. So this is what the Transport England have come up with, Highways England. You'll see that it incorporates a couple of bugs in the shape of people splattered on the screen of the vehicle. Claire said that when she saw the campaign, she thought it was a spoof. And writing on Facebook, she said they had 2 people dressed as squashed flies on the windscreen. Did they not see the analogy? Well, apparently not. Highways England's acting chief executive, who's Nick Harris, said this campaign is just one of many steps we're taking to invest in our network with safety as our #1 priority. We're doing everything we can to help drivers feel confident on our motorways. And frankly, it has to be said that this is a highly curious and I would say insensitive way of going forward with this particular campaign. Okay, something I've talked about on many occasions over the last year is the increasing prevalence of electric motorcycles, and the times they really are changing. Sorry, Bob. At the weekend, I mentioned that Honda had suffered the biggest dip in powered 2-wheel sales in 50 years. Things didn't go quite as badly in China as in some of their other markets, but they still lost 20% of sales over previous years. But here is something really interesting. Overall, China saw a moderately positive increase in motorcycle sales. And it's being suggested that this growing demand is actually being driven by electric motorcycles and scooters as people switch away from petrol engine motorcycles to what they see as a green power source. As I've pointed out over the last year, this demand is actually being filled by new players in the powered 2-wheeler market because there's been distinctly lethargic movements from the conventional suppliers of petrol engine bikes to fill this new niche. And it's another sign that there's a very rapid market change underway. And I think if the Japanese manufacturers, as well as BMW, Triumph, Ducati, and the rest of the non-Japanese bike builders, if they don't act soon, I think they risk losing certainly the all-important small bike end of the market to these innovators. And that's a really valuable resource for these bike builders. The sales of small bikes are not inconsiderable. Whatever you might say about the Livewire, at least Harley do have an electric machine available right at this moment. But turning the clock back 100 years, Moto Guzzi were founded on the 15th of March 1921, so they were 100 years old on Monday. The Società Anonima Moto Guzzi was established with the goal of manufacturing and sales of motorcycles and any other activity pertinent or connected to the metal mechanical industry. And the eagle with the spread wings was chosen as their new company symbol, and that's been the logo for Moto Guzzi ever since. They opened production at Mandello del Lario in the same plant where Moto Guzzis are still produced. So although Moto Guzzi is still sort of strong on heritage, they certainly weren't short on innovation. The first wind tunnel in the motorcycle world was built in the 1950s, and it can still be visited apparently at the Mandello plant, and that helped the company achieve no less than 15 world speed titles and 11 tourist trophies in that decade. You may remember they built a V8 engine, an astonishing development at a time when most motorcycles were still singles. They also developed the dustbin fairing, which helped those bikes to some scary speeds. They were a bit of a handful apparently in side winds, which is why they were eventually banned, and which is why we have the shape of fairings on motorcycles that we do now, the ones that expose the front wheel. Another innovation, or defining feature at least, is the Cardan shaft final drive, which first appeared on Moto Guzzi's in the 1970s in their 700cc 90-degree V twin. And that basic engine design, although it's now fitted with all the kind of electronic advancements you'd expect, continues to evolve to support their model range a century on. But I have to say there is something of an eye on their heritage in the current model range rather than the future. But even so, with the heritage aspect in mind, I'm amazed that they haven't launched an updated version of the absolutely iconic Moto Guzzi Le Mans. In my opinion, it's still one of the most stunningly beautiful machines ever built. Right, okay, so to round off today's show, I've been watching the Road Safety GB presentations online, which I mentioned to you on Sunday. I've been catching up with a couple of them. And yesterday they had one of the, I think Neil Gregg, I think it is. I've forgotten his name. Apologies if you're not Neil Gregg. Presenting the reports of a piece of research that IAM Road Smart commissioned into deciding whether or not IAM training actually had beneficial effects for their riders. They commissioned a company called Agilis to basically take what they hoped would be comparable samples of advanced riders trained by the IAM and ordinary riders who haven't had the benefits of IAM training. And what they looked at were the attitudes to safety, riding behavior, self-reported incident history, and speed choices in a range of riding scenarios. And what they then did was they analyzed those results, and they were able to draw a conclusion that IAM Road Smart coaching does deliver safer, more confident riders who get more enjoyment out of their motorcycling. At least that was what they concluded. Now, I'm always at risk of getting knocked by the IAM readership of my page for knocking the IAM themselves. But in this case, I'm still trying to digest some of the conclusions of the article, and also to flag up, I think, some of the statements that were made in the conclusion that put a positive spin on a piece of evidence that perhaps doesn't really support that conclusion. Keith Wheeler has just said it's Neil Gregg, Policy and Research Director, IAM Road Smart. Thank you there, Keith. Now, one apparent contradiction in the text appeared to me. The text of the document actually says the journey purpose frequencies were relatively similar between the two groups of responders. In other words, people jumped on their bikes and did the same things. They said there were some differences with a higher percentage of IAM Road Smart respondents more likely to indicate that they often motorcycled for holidays, touring and sightseeing. Right, okay, well that's in itself is a fairly major difference. So arguing that everything's the same and then saying there's a difference, immediately sort of flags up to me that we're not looking at apples and apples here. What really confused me though was when I went to look at the bar chart, because it attempts to show via two charts that the control group rides for pleasure less than the IAM group. But when I actually looked at the chart, it appeared to be the other way around. It appeared that the non-IAM group actually used their bikes more for pleasure purposes than the IAM group. And I don't understand that. possibly somebody's made a mistake in the data or the chart. I doubt they've drawn the wrong conclusion. So my guess is that the wrong number's gone into the chart, or perhaps I'm just not understanding how the chart is referencing the numbers, because it's not absolute numbers saying that they're doing something on their bike, that they're showing taking 100% of the sample and deciding whether they use their bikes often, moderately, regularly, or infrequently for particular roles. So perhaps when you count the numbers of riders who are responding in each section, perhaps you get a different result, but that's not what the chart shows. So there's a contradiction there between what the chart shows and what the text says. I'm still trying to make head and tail of that. But skipping on past that, the big conclusion of the report is that compared with demographically similar motorcyclists, in other words, riders who do much the same thing in much the same place, in much the same way on their bikes, IAM road smarts do demonstrate more positive attitudes towards behaviours related to collision risk and report fewer collisions once mileage is accounted for. Well, okay. What do we know about that? Well, the first thing to say is that the authors quickly realised that their two samples weren't directly comparable because the IM riders covered more miles, which again comes back to that holidaying, riding for pleasure out in the country. The implication is that the riders who aren't covering so many miles, the control group, probably covering miles in town. I don't know, doesn't really say. So they expanded the second sample to bring in more riders, and then did some complex statistical juggling till they were happy they were looking at very similar samples. And then this is where they got the idea that the IAM riders were covering more miles between crashes. But as I say, are we really covering a sort of a comparison of apples and apples? The report says that the IM riders are more likely to ride higher mileages. They're more likely to ride for holidays. They're more likely to ride all year round, less likely to ride for errands, less likely to ride 5 days a week. So, you've got a more likely, less likely comparison there again. Is this apples and apples, or is it apples and oranges? I'd suggest that if you have a significant number of commuters in the second group, that a mile of riding in London, for example, is a very different challenge to a mile of riding on nice quiet B road. And commuting for an hour twice a day, 5 times a week, is a very different challenge to going out for a 2-hour run with your local group on a Sunday morning, even though you might cover the same distance. So, again, I'm not entirely happy with this crash per mile comparison being entirely valid. Again, need to dig deeper into the figures to see exactly how they got to that conclusion. Now, something else that popped up in the conclusions was that IM riders are actually more likely to be involved in different types of collision. They're less likely to have crashes with another vehicle, but they are more likely to be involved in what is called a single vehicle collision. Well, I'm not quite entirely sure how you have a single vehicle collision unless you collide with a hard object at the side of the road. I would prefer that if that was simply termed a crash, it'd be a lot easier to understand. But again, this falls in line with what we already know about crashing. If IM riders are spending more time out of town, that's the kind of crash they are more likely to have. We know statistically that it's the younger riders on smaller capacity machines who are overrepresented in crashes in urban areas, and if you're going to look at a crash in an urban area, there's a goodly chance it's a collision with a vehicle at a junction. Now, interestingly, the control group included some respondents on mopeds. Not surprisingly, the IAM group didn't. So what else did the report tell us? Well, it told us that IM riders only crash every 15,000 miles compared with 9,000 for the control group. Well, to be honest, that doesn't sound like a great figure. What else? The IM Road Smart respondents tended to select a higher speed choice than similar motorcyclists. Now, how they worked this one out was they basically showed you a pair of photos and then asked a very basic "how fast would you go" question. And of this pair of photos, one would show a situation with a hazard. For example, they would show a zebra crossing, but with a pedestrian walking towards it, whilst the other one would show the same zebra crossing, but minus pedestrians on the pavement. And the interesting thing is that whilst both groups suggested a lower speed when the hazard was present, the IAM group consistently suggested a somewhat higher speed was appropriate in both the hazard present and the hazard absent cases. Now, I was reminded by a friend who'd also read the conclusions of the report into the study on Bike Safe Scotland all the way back in 2003 to quote from that study. However, there was evidence to suggest that some of the Bike Safe participants may be riding faster in some situations after taking part in Bike Safe. It may be that some participants are engaging in risk compensation. They feel that they've become better riders and are therefore better equipped to ride at speed. Now, the IAM report actually recognises this, though there is a bit of an attempt to put a positive spin on the issue. So this is what the release, which shows what it says. This could be due to increased confidence amongst IAM Road Smart members. Being a confident rider is not necessarily a bad thing, especially when taken in conjunction with the findings of a lower collision rate per miles ridden, the different types of collision experience, and the statistically significant better attitudes towards safety. IAM Road Smart could explore ways to ensure that membership does not convert confidence into overconfidence. So basically, what you're seeing is a bit of juggling here. They're saying, yes, we've got some good results on one side, but the other side's not quite so good, but we can put a positive spin on it. But overconfidence is a real problem after any training, and it's why my own training always avoids a focus on making progress as a benefit of advanced riding. The thing I've always said is that progress is a consequence of making better decisions when it comes to identifying and executing a riding plan to deal with threats. So basically, speed comes after we've recognized and dealt with all the places that we ought to go slower. It's not the thing we should be looking for. It's a consequence of making decisions correctly in other places. There were two other concerns in the report: some differences in attitude and behavior between those IAM respondents who completed their test more recently compared to long ago. And it also suggested that refresher training and a focus on bend approach speeds could be beneficial, because that was another finding, that IAM riders consistently approach bends faster. The biggest negative difference, in fact, in the results were that the non-IAM riders crashed less often on corners. And there was also one finding that I thought was actually really quite concerning. And it's why I approach the riding as being something where we all have to take personal responsibility for our safety. The report said it is interesting to note the percentages of those who were involved in collision and thought they were at fault. For the comparison group, i.e. the non-IAM group, 19% of those in damage only and 27% of those in injury collisions did not think they were at fault. Okay, so basically a big chunk of those riders thought that there was something they could have done in that situation to have improved the outcome. By contrast, the figures for the IAM Road Smart respondents were 49% of those in damage only and 67% of those in injury collisions. And these are the riders who did not think they were at fault for these crashes. In other words, IAM riders were far more likely to blame the other road user. Now, that's a really, really unhealthy attitude, in my opinion. Anyway, let's finish with the final part of the summary. These results are not statistically significant. In other words, they didn't really find quite what they were hoping to find. It should be remembered that it's not possible to determine if undertaking road smart training is responsible for these differences. Characteristics which attracted motorcyclists to join IAM Road Smart could be influencing their attitudes to safety and riding in general, which is something that many people have commented on about post-test training. And it also goes back to the discussion that I was watching last week with Karen Cole and various other people, including Colin Brown and Mags, talking as if post-test training was the solution to lack of riding skills. You'll only get people undertaking post-test training who have an interest in improving their riding skills. You really, really need to focus on getting the compulsory training side of things to a higher standard if you want to get all riders to ride in a better manner. Okay, so how do you go about testing your course to see whether it works or not? And the answer is, of course, you have to do a controlled experiment. And again, the document recognizes this when it says this could only be determined by comparing IAM Road Smart members before they actually join the organization to understand if they have a propensity to think and act in certain ways. So really, you have to do an experiment with one group that doesn't go through the IAM process and one group that does go through the IAM process, but you study them before they take the course and you see what happens in the long term after their training course. And this has actually been done in Australia with one of their basic training courses. They've actually done this, and what they found was significantly better behavior by the riders who took the course initially. But what happened eventually was that the ordinary riders, the ones who hadn't taken the course, kind of came up to join them. There was a bit of slippage downwards from the group that had taken the training initially, but mostly what happened was the untrained group, as it were, came up to meet them. So the idea that, again, that you get a big benefit from advanced training, there are questions to be asked. And I have to say that applies to all training, my own included. To answer this question, a pre and post evaluation could be conducted to understand attitudes, behaviours and interests of Road Smart members before they've joined the organisation. Well, I have to say that one of the problems with these kind of self-reporting studies, the ones where you ask people questions, is that people very often don't answer the question honestly, not necessarily because they want to give a different impression to the reviewer than they would want to be revealed about themselves, but simply because we all tend to hold views about ourselves which are inaccurate. Ask a sample of 10 people how many of them are better drivers than average, and the figure that's always reported is that about 7 or 8 out of 10 will say we're better than average. Think about the mathematics. It isn't possible. You simply cannot have more than half the room better than average. It doesn't calculate. So we tend to be inaccurate in self-reporting. So realistically, what you'd have to do is actually go ahead with an external evaluation. You'd really have to put riders through some kind of external to the IAM altogether riding evaluation before they did the training, and then a post training evaluation and see how it changed. You could do it with a simulator, you could do it out on the road. There are a number of ways forward for this, but simply asking people questions with still photos is a pretty damn crude method of trying to judge any kind of benefit for a training course. All right, I've whittled on for far too long on that one, but the answer to the question, does IAM training make for safer riders, the answer really remains, and the document admits it more or less, is that we hope so, but we really don't know all that clearly. So, okay, that's the end of today's show. But just before I sign off, don't forget that Free Friday webinar. The next one, we'll be looking at a bit of chain preparation. And again, we'll be doing a little bit more on personal fitness. We'll have just over a week to sort of start loosening up again. It's also a good time to watch my growing collection of 60-second safety videos, which are on Facebook, but also over on YouTube on my Survival Skills UK channel. And don't forget, tips on Tuesday, skills on Saturday. The Facebook posts are now posted and indexed also on my Ko-fi page, where you can get hold of the archive as well, which is hundreds and hundreds of articles which have already gone up. And last but not least, don't forget the newsletter. You can subscribe to that. The address is in the initial, well, it's somewhere, I'm not sure where it is actually. I'll find it for you. Right, okay, and on that slightly confused note, I'll draw everything to a close here, and wish you a good rest of the week, and stay safe out there on your bikes. All right, bye for now, from Kevin Williams and Elevenses.